Hey, this is Jem Morris, and you're listening to another episode of Bright New Voices, the Balboa Press Hour. The Ochre of Abundance, Poems, Volume 16 by Wendy E. Slater is the third poetry book in Slater's Traduka Wisdom poetry series to be published. Her poetry is the expression and integration of the inner dialogue with divinity and the spiritual journey of self-discovery through vision quests, spiritual awakenings, and the dark night of the soul. Her poetic formulas are both wisdom and method, a sharing of words that opens doors for readers and invites them on their own spiritual journey of awakening and healing. Wendy E. Slater, thank you so much for being on our show today. It's so great to talk with you.
Hey, Jem. Thank you for having me.
Wendy, you took a 20-year hiatus from writing poetry. What motivated you to begin writing again?
Yeah, it was approximately a 20-year hiatus. I've written my whole life. I stopped because I felt such angst with what I was writing, internal turmoil within myself. And it's interesting because looking back at that poetry now, as, a 54-year-old woman, I go, wow, there's no angst in there. So I think it really was truly a reflection of that age of wanting to explore different avenues of the world, knowing I had to do other things besides write poetry before I got back to writing poetry, if that makes sense to you.
Sure, absolutely.
I started writing again. It actually just poured out of me. I was on a mystical sojourn to Scotland, and I can't explain it. It was like a faucet opened in me. For about 10 years, it just kept pouring out of me. It was waiting to come. But in between, I needed to study. So I studied conservation biology and science, which I had never studied before as an older student at college. And those are all integral things. I find conservation biology to be extremely spiritual, and all the science that I studied as well. And so that is the knowledge I needed, the wisdom to incorporate into my new voice 20 years later when I started writing again.
That is the knowledge. Was it also the inspiration?
Interesting. Yes, it fundamentally was. It really fundamentally was. It was about the awareness that was like a chord that went off in my soul of understanding the intricate nature and oneness of everything through my studies of biology and science, and seeing the spiritual essence in all of that, and knowing the whole time there was something larger, the whole universe, the little bit we see when we look up into the sky out there. And it truly was an awakening that had to integrate into me on an intellectual level before it could really expand spiritually.
Well, before we continue on with this interview, I want to give our listeners a chance to hear some examples of these poems and of your writing. Would you be able to read a couple for us today?
I'd love to. This is poem 1639 from the Ochre of Abundance. And I should say each of the volumes, the titles are all numbered. So the volume before this, all the poems are 1501 through whatever the last poem is. So this is the 39th poem in the Ochre of Abundance. A kiss is a kiss, but breath unfolding into breath is the lotus, outstretched radiance, unfurled 10-fingered gem, a jeweled transect of heart to beaded pulse, of tender tendrils collapsed and breathing, rebirth from the decay, of seeded, discarded fruits, strewn like constellations from the eye, to find home again as if it was always there.
I love that one. Do you consider your writing to be liberating?
Entirely. And I really haven't written too much in the past 3 years while I've had to focus on editing and everything to do with publishing. And it is the greatest communion with divinity for me, no matter what I'm writing about. It is a clear channel to divinity, and it's beyond meditation. It's the most beautiful thing. I feel so gifted to be able to experience it and share it with people.
Well, really, in my opinion, Wendy, your poems seem to take the reader on a journey. Was that your intention?
No, it wasn't a conscious intention at all, but that's exactly what the poetry does. I think the poetry, when I began writing it, after my 20-year hiatus, it was about my dialogue. It was sharing the dialogue with divinity. And I'm looking back on the first volume, which isn't published yet. And ultimately, what I've come to see is that my experiencing and the coding in the poetry allows the reader to transform within themselves, to release and remember their authentic self, their true inner wisdom. And that is an individual thing. We all are rays of the light, but we all have our unique frequency of that ray, if that makes sense to you. I'm sure it does.
It does. Do you believe that these poems are needed now more than ever?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think it's a time where things are moving so fast. There's a lot of stress and anxiety in this modern reality, partly because things are moving so fast. Yet on the other level, things are starting to accelerate so fast because of a vibrational shift that's going on in the planet, which is positive. You know, I'm walking people through a darkness. Even if the poetry is not dark, it's their subconscious, their unconscious, and conscious levels, as well as the collective of those frequencies, so that they can touch self-forgiveness, release from it, release judgment, release self-blame, and come to a place of freeing themselves up. A lot of this is false tethers, you know, the shame that is constantly bombarded in this reality. And there's a difference from taking self-responsibility for an action than shaming yourself.
Sure.
And one is liberating and one is confining.
Well, and secrecy as well. Secrecy really fosters that kind of shame. And when we talk about our feelings, we talk about what's going on collectively, I think that raises our awareness and our consciousness with one another.
Yeah, absolutely. I think about, you know, we look back 20 years ago, what secrets people couldn't talk about, experiences in the life, and how commonplace they are. They are people sharing things without the shame or learning how to walk through it and understand there's nothing to be ashamed of. Mm-hmm. You know, we're all have the heart seed of love in us, and it's touching it, opening it, and letting it heal. And one by one, as we do that, oneness, that will come in to our planet.
Do you think that your poetry reminds your readers of their authenticity?
Absolutely. I've spent the past 3 years learning from my readers, learned so much from them, and appreciate their input and feedback. And I'm also a shaman and have a healing practice. And I've been called a heart whisperer and a soul whisperer. And I think that's what the poetry does. Actually, I know that's what the poetry does for people. So it's reminding them of their authentic soul and their authentic wisdom and awakening them within themselves to that memory, so that it's no longer a memory, it's an actuality.
Sure. On Amazon, I read a reviewer who wrote, quote, "Every time I read this masterpiece, I fall in love with it all over again." And that's really what we're talking about here today.
And I think, yeah, but I think it's also people learning to fall in love with themselves. That's the first step.
Well, the message is so beautiful and so healing. Wendy, I want to give our listeners an opportunity to learn more about you. I know that you do have a website where you share more poetry. You also share information about your quantum healing practice. What is that website?
Oh, thanks for asking. It's www.traduka.com, and I'll spell Traduka. It's T as in Tom, R as in Robert, A as in Apple, D as in Dog, U as in Uncle, K as in Karen, A as in Apple.
Wendy E. Slater, thank you so much for being on the show today. It was really lovely having you on.